everyone, welcome to our discussion this day. Now, prepare yourselves as we venture another topic for this subject. The topic that we will discuss is constructs and models. At the end of this module, you will be able to determine what are the constructs and models, identify the different concept about communicative competence model, and differentiate the difference between models, frameworks, and test specifications has provided the basis for critique of the Common European Framework. In language testing and assessment, we have come to rely on models of what is variously called language proficiency, communicative competence, or communicative language ability or CLA. The terminology that is used has become confusing as pointed out by many commentators. The confusion is further compounded because the terms model and framework are used with a range of different meanings in the testing context. We take models to be overarching and relatively abstract theoretical descriptions of what it means to be able to communicate in a second language, and we reserve frameworks to be a selection of skills and abilities from a model that are relevant to a specific assessment context. We will reserve the word construct as describing the components of a model. The real dilemma is navigation of these terms with respect to test development. We can distinguish three levels of increasing detail. First, theoretical models, assessment frameworks, and last, test specifications. A framework is very different from a model. A framework document mediates between a model, which is a high-level abstract document, and test specifications, which are generative blueprints or plans for a specific test. It is not possible to write test items and tasks directly from a framework or model. If a model attempts to describe all that we know about language knowledge and language use, a framework might sample from the model to be relevant to a specific context. This understanding of the difference between models, frameworks, and test specifications has provided the basis for critics of the Common European Framework of reference as a model rather than a framework. The nature of models. McNamara argues that all models of language ability have three dimensions: model of knowledge, what it means to know a language; model of performance, all the factors that influence our ability to communicate; and lastly, actual language use, or the used language in real-world situations. The first is what Himes called knowledge, and the second, ability for use. This second category contains all the factors that influence our ability to communicate. This may include individual factors such as how we feel, our general health or personality factors. As such, they are not always related to language, but impact upon our ability to use language generally or in certain contexts. It is these first two dimensions that are often referred to as communicative competence or communicative language ability, while the third dimension in actual language use rather than the knowledge or ability for use that makes language use possible. McNamara knows that models help us to articulate the theoretical rationale for such inferences, as we may draw from test scores to the abilities of an individual test taker. From specific instances of language use, we trace the meaning of the score back to its meaning in a framework, which includes contextual features, and then to a model of communicative competence. This is a key part of what it means to consider the validity of the score meaning.
Canali and Swain Model of Communicative Competence. Canali and Swain 1980 produced the first and most influential model of what they called communicative competence, defining communicative competence as leading to more useful and effective second language teaching and allowing more valid and reliable measurement of second language communication skills. Canali and Swain therefore present a model of knowledge into which sociolinguistic competence is added. Communicative competence, a model of knowledge which is made up of grammatical competence, sociolinguistic knowledge, and strategic competence. Grammatical competence is the knowledge of grammar, lexis, morphology, syntax, semantics, and phonology. Another is socio-linguistic knowledge, or also known as socio-linguistic competence, is the knowledge of the socio-cultural rules of language use and rules of discourse. And lastly is the strategic competence, the knowledge of how to overcome problems when faced with difficulties in communication. Actual communication. Actual communication is the demonstration of knowledge in actual language performance. Canali and Swain outline Himes' notion of a speech event in terms of participants, settings, form, topic, purpose, key, channel, code, norms of interactions, norm of interpretation, and genre. The speech event is said to be the basis for understanding rules of language. This seminal model of communication is relevant to language testing for several reasons. Firstly, the distinction between communicative competence and actual performance means that this should contain tasks that require actual performance as well as tasks or item types that measure knowledge. These type of tasks would allow test takers to demonstrate their knowledge in action. This is theoretical rationale, for the view of pencil and paper test of knowledge alone cannot directly indicate whether a language learner can actually speak or write in a communicative situation. Secondly, as communicative competent who was viewed as knowledge, discrete point tests were seen as useful for some purpose. Discrete point tests using items that tested just one isolated them of grammar, for example, have been heavily criticized in the communicative revolution of the 1970s. But Canali and Swain argued that this criticism was not theoretically sound. Thirdly, the model, especially if it were more fine-grained, could be used to develop criteria for the evaluation of language performance at different levels of proficiency. It is clear that the implication of a model of language competence and use have much to say about how we evaluate language performance, award a score to the performance, and therefore interpret the score in terms of what we hypothesize the test taker is able to do non-test situations. Canali and Swain explicitly claimed that explicating a theory of performance was impossible, as it would have to contain all the variables unrelated to linguistic knowledge that they may impact on communication. However, by 1983, Canali began to introduce such model, thus changing the definition of communicative competence to resemble more closely the original arguments put forward by Himes. Further, Canali 1983 says that used the term of performance and began to use actual communication to mean the realization of such knowledge and skills under limiting psychological and environmental conditions such as memory and perceptual constraints, fatigue, nervousness, distractions, and interfering background noises. As Canali explicitly states that communicative competence refers to both knowledge and skill in using the knowledge when interacting in actual communication. The introduction of factors such as those mentioned above certainly open what McNamara has termed Pandora's box. When modeling communicative competence and performance, we now have to account for both psychological and contextual variables. It has only been relatively recently that the models have included what we term performance conditions, or descriptions of the context in which language is actually used. These tend to be attached to models that use to task facets to structure a difficulty continuum from the less to most demanding. One such model is the Canadian Language Benchmark, or the CVL. Look at the following description of social interaction at the basic proficiency level. What the person can do. Use and respond the basic courtesy formula. Example of task and text. Hello, how are you? My name is Lee. Thank you. Bye. Sorry. The performance indicator is to respond to greetings, courtesy, leave taking. What the person can do. Indicate problems in communication. For example, pardon, repeat please. This may initiate apologize, or indicate problems in communicating verbally or non-verbally. We are told that the associated performance conditions are interaction assured, face-to-face, informal, and with one person at a time. Learner's speech is guided by questions from the interlocutor. Learner's speech is encouraged by feedback from the interlocutor. Example, aha, I see, or nood. Instruction is short 2 to 3 words utterance. Communicative competence for Canali was now seen as distinct from actual communication, made up of knowledge, whether it is conscious or unconscious, and the skill needed to use this knowledge in actual communication. Knowledge and skill were seen as underlying capacities, while their manifestation in concrete situation was actual communication. The notion of grammatical competence remains unchanged for the definition provided by Canali and Swain, but there are significant changes to the definition of other competence. Firstly, sociolinguistic competence now refers only to sociocultural rules, and the rules of discourse have been taken into new category of discourse competence. Sociolinguistic competence is the appropriateness of meaning, whether function, attitudes, and ideas are appropriate to context, and of form, how appropriate the realization of functions, attitudes, and ideas are in specific context, thus incorporating pragmatics. However, Canali clearly indicates that this notion has also been expanded to include the appropriateness of nonverbal behavior and awareness of physical space and distance in communication proxemics, as these are also involved the creation of social meaning. In the 1980 model, strategic competence was defined as a set of compensatory strategies that could be used to overcome breakdowns or problems in communications. Canali here expands the definition includes strategies that enhance the effectiveness of communication, such as changing the speed or pitch of delivery for theoretical effect. The new category of discourse competence is defined as the ability to produce a unified spoken or written text in different genres, using cohesion in form and coherence in meaning. Although this does not differ in definition from the 1980 model, its appearance as a separate category indicates its perceived importance as both knowledge and enabling skill. The Canali and Swain model, as adopted by Canali 1983 has provided the basis for all further work in this field. Communicative competence under is the knowledge and skill, grammatical competence, sociolinguistic competence, strategic competence, then discourse competence. Then actual communication is the stance use of language.
So in my topic, I will be discussing the Bachmann's model of communicative language ability, or CLA. Bachmann's model of CLA is an expansion of what went before and does two things which make it different from earlier models. So first, it clearly distinguishes between what constitutes knowledge and what constitutes a skill, which was left unclear in the model of conduct. The second is it explicitly attempts to characterize the process by which language use occurs, according to Bachmann's 1990. So there are three components of CLA, which is the language competence or the knowledge, strategic competence, the capacity for implementing the components of language competence in contextualized communication language use. And the third is psychophysiological mechanism, which enable the actual execution of language as a physical phenomenon. So the strategic competence is also said to be affected by the knowledge structures or the world knowledge for the language users. So let's move on to, so there are also components of communicative language ability, language use. So the language competence or there are two competence of language, which is the organizational and pragmatic competence. So the two elements of discourses competence, which is the cohesion and coherence, are split up. So the cohesion occurs explicitly under textual competence, while coherence as a title disappears and is assumed under elocutionary competence. This is because the left-hand branch of the three concerns that formal aspect of language usage, comprising grammatical competence and textual competence. The latter concerns knowledge of how texts spoken or written are structured so that they are recognized as conventional by hearers or readers. So the right-hand side of the tree is now described by the superordinate term pragmatic competence, which is defined as the acceptability of adherence within specific context of language use, and rules determining the successful use of language within specified context. So in pragmatic competence, they broke into two further components, which is the elocutionary competence and the sociolinguistic competence. In elocutionary competence concern the performance of the language functions as described by Halliday in 1973 and Speech Act following by Austin in 1962. So in ideal functions is expressing proposition, information, or feelings. And the second is manipulative functions. In manipulative function, it affecting the world around us, including the three, which is the instrumental, regulatory, and interactional. In instrumental, these are getting things done through the use of speech acts. And in regulatory, controlling the behaviors of others. And the third is the interactional, which is the managing interpersonal relationship. And the third is the heuristic functions, which is the extending our knowledge of the world. And the last one in elocutionary competence, which is the imaginative functions, which is the humorous or aesthetic use of language. So let's move on to sociolinguistic competence. So sociolinguistic competence is defined as the sensitivity to or control to the conventions of language use that are determined by the features of the specific language. Specific language use context enables us to perform language functions in ways that are appropriate to the context. So that's according to Bachman in 1990. The components that are identified as being relevant are the sensitivity to dialect or variety, and sensitivity to register. So in sensitive to register, there are three discourses, which is the field of discourse or context, and model of discourse or the discourse domain, and style of discourse, which is the prosen, formal, consultative, casual, intimate. And the sensitive to naturalness is what we would expect a native to say in that context, and the cultural references and figure of speech. So everything that occurs under the hierarchy in figure A3-4 is part of the model of language knowledge. It is strategic competence that now drives the model of the ability of language use. Bachman argues that strategic competence is best seen in terms of a psycholinguistic model of speech production made up of three components. First is the assessment of component. In assessment of component, there are identified information needed for realizing a communicative goal in particular context. Second is decide which language competence we have to achieve the goal. And the third is decide which ability and knowledge we share with our interlocutor. And the last is evaluate the extent to which communication is successful. The second is planning component. First, retrieve information from language competence. Second, select modality or channel. The third is assemble an utterance. And the last component is the execution component. Execution components is use psychophysical mechanism to realize the utterance. So in Bachman and Palmer in 1996, a text which took forward and made more explicit some of the changes that Bachman had made to the Canal and Swain formation, and which sought to articulate the model for the teaching of language testing. Finally, strategic competence is defined as a set of metacognitive strategies or higher order process that explain the interactions of the knowledge and effective components of language use.
Saucy, Morsham, Dorney, and Sorrell 1995 said that communication competence is not a matter of knowing rules for a composition of sentence and being able to employ such rules to assemble expressions from scratch as and when occasions requires. It is much more a matter of knowing a stack of partially pre-assembled patterns, frameworks, and a kit of rules, so to speak, and being able to apply the rules to make whatever adjustments are necessary according to contextualized standards.
Salsi, Morsha et al. Are critical of the types of content specification that have been developed on and the Hawk basics for syllabus design because they were not built on a model of communicative competence. Produce a detailed description of what communicative competence entails in order to use the subcomponents as a content base in syllabus design in 1995.
This 1995 model is a pyramid enclosing a circle surrounded by another circle. The circle inside the pyramid is discourse competence, the core or central competence. The 3 points of the triangle are the top-down sociocultural competence and the bottom-up linguistic competence and actional competence. The arrows indicates that the various components are constantly interacting with each other and the discourse component. This construct thus place the discourse component in a central position where the lexicogrammatical resources, the actional organizing skills, and the socio-cultural context all come together and shape the discourse. The circle surrounding the pyramid is strategic competence, an available inventory of communicative, cognitive, and metacognitive strategies that allow the skilled interlocutor to negotiate meanings, resolve ambiguities, and to compensate for deficiencies in any of the other competences.
For Salsi, Morsha et al., discourse competence, it concerned of the selection, sequencing, and arrangement of words, structures, sentences, and utterance to achieve a unified spoken or writing text. Linguistic competence, grammatical competence plus lexis and phonology as well as syntax and morphology. Actional competence, knowledge required to understand communicative intent by interpreting speech acts. Sociocultural competence, the knowledge related to content that impacts upon what is said and how it is said. Strategic competence is a set of skills for overcoming communication problem or deficiencies in other competences. These models appears to have brought as full circle. The authors are also explicit in stating that a model is not directly relevant as a whole to all teaching content.
One of the important contribution of Salsi, Morsha et al. 1995 was to specify that the various components of communicative competence were interrelated, and that is was important to properly describe the nature of these interrelationships in order to fully understand the construct of communicative competence.
Let us proceed to the interactional competence. At this point, I will be going to discuss about what interactional competence is and how to use this approach for second language teaching. According to Morsha and others, interactional competence includes the first, the conversational structure component of discourse competence. Second, the nonverbal communicative factors component of socio-cultural competence. Last, all of the components of strategic competence. Now, when we say conversational structure component, it is actually a method in which is ito yung ginagamit ni speakers to manage a conversation turn or to structure conversation efficiently. And talking about conversational structure component, it includes sequential organization, turn-taking organization, and the ability to repair speech. Now, let's discuss these three one by one. Sequential organization is an ordered and combined to make actions take place in conversations such as requests, offers, complaints, and announcements. To make it short, sequential organization, it is how do we open a story and how we close a conversation. One of the best example here is in a form of a conversation, it is very important that you are giving a signal to each other on what's the next thing thing to do and who is the next to talk. So it makes sense that if we navigate to a conversation, it is very important that we are giving signal to each other. So yun yung sequential organization. Kung sa baga, a sequence or an order to take a place in a conversation. And speaking of turn-taking organization, it is a term for the manner in which orderly conversation normally takes place. So in a conversation, how does the speaker gets floor or how does the speaker get to talk? So in short, kapag sinabi natin turn-taking organization, it is how people know when it's their turn to speak. One of the example here is me and my friend talked about politics and she's sharing her thoughts about her candidates on this upcoming election. I kept quiet while she's having a moment. And when she's done talking, I take the turn to speak and share my opinion or my thoughts about my candidates. So try to observe how I take turn in a conversation. As you can observe, it is when she becomes quiet. It means she's done talking and obviously that's your time to speak because in a conversation you cannot just simply overlap in a conversation. So you need to wait your turn to speak and that's actually the turn-taking organization is how people know if it's their turn to talk. Next, we have the ability to repair speech. So from the word itself, repair, meaning is the process by which a speaker recognizes a speech error and repeats what has been said when some of correction. So repair was there para ma-solve yung error na yon. In a conversation, when people talk at the same time, it causes trouble, right? Because of repair, the trouble will easily solve. And if that's the case, the flow of a conversation will end smoothly because there is a repair of a speech. Again, repair is some kind of a correction or corrections or how do we solve problem in a conversation. Again, those three I mentioned earlier, which are the sequential organization, the turn-taking organization, and the ability to repair speech is include siya doon sa conversational structure component, which is it has something to do in interactional competence. Let's go back to the origin of interactional competence. So ano nga ba yung interactional competence? This point, there are so many philosophers who argued kung ano yung exact meaning ng interactional, kung ano bang involved dito at marami pa. According to Crumbs, communication is not assigned in a single person only because when we say interactional, meaning it involves two or more participants. Kasi nga, how do we interact if isa lang yung involved na participant? So to make it short, in a conversation, it occurs two or more participants in order na mag-change sila ng thoughts and not just a single person. And if involves na yung two or more two participants changing thoughts, doon na yung interaction, which is the communication become possible. He and Young in 1998 also argued that interactional is not born that resides in individual. So meaning we have to interact with others because meaning is developed by individual in communication. Let us relate this knowledge of interactional competence into interpretation of actual utterance, which is the performance. So, paano ba natin i-apply yung interactional competence sa actual na? So, by performing. And one of the example here is, since interactional competence, it has something to do in performance. So, the best I apply here is that when we treat the assessment of test takers. So, paano ba natin apply sa interactional competence dito? When we assess at the takers, it means we need to interact our partner. So, the tester there is also a rater of your assessment. Now, in terms of task, we must consider kung ano yung activities that are likely to be generated. In terms of interaction, we need to figure out what constitutes construct a relevant variance in the score, or meaning that can't be assigned to the person getting the score, and how much of the score indicates in individual's interaction competence. So as a result, we must consider what parts of performance can constitute realizations of interactional competence that can be attributed to the context bound joint construction that occurs in encounters, including an oral test, rather than to a person. Such aspects of performance would be those that arise directly out of the adaptivity of one speaker to another. The way, let us not confuse about the adaptivity I've mentioned earlier, because adaptivity there is not an oral or it's not an adapt test, because when talking about natural adaptivity, it occurs in all oral discourse as people participate in intricate conversational procedures to communicate with one another. And the simplest example of the principle of adaptivity in second language communication is that accommodation by Berwick and Ross, in which is katong it is coming from a natural adaptation, like yung skillful na daan or yung mga hawd na speaker kay nag-adapt og speech from a skillful din na interlocutor. Then, if that's the case, the communication will run smooth for others.
From models to frameworks, validity models and performance conditions. Models of communicative competence and performance form an important basis for what our test score means, and they help us to decide the extent to which the score can be generalized to other performances. So, models of communicative competence and performance is a necessary tool, and it contributes huge partiality to understand the qualification of every performer. But still, we can never claim that a test can predict all future performances in all conditions. This is why test providers need to specify the audience for their test and the uses to which score may put. Tests or performances have outcomes and impact on the world, and ultimately, it should be these test effects that drive the final design decisions about crafting particular items and tasks. So the process of doing this involves careful consideration of the performance condition under which stakers are capable of operating, and this, in turn, provide the framework from which test specifications are generated. Ware 2004. So Johnny Ware is the youngest U.S. national champion since 1991. In 2004, he is the first skater to win U.S. nationals 3 times in a row since Brian Boitano in the last 1980s, and he is the first American to win Cup of Russia 2007. In this unit, we have distinguished between 3 levels of description. At the most abstract level is the theoretical model that provides a description of the universe of construct as we currently understand it. This may be expressed in terms of skills, knowledge, and abilities, but may be extended to include a range of contextual and processing factors. So all of these are relevant to language learning in general. But for testing, we would need to select from this and demonstrate relevance to the specific purpose of our test. So a model helps us to articulate the theoretical rationale for our test and relate the meaning of the specific test performance to language competence and ability for language use.